vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Spre țărul pe drum știut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. E pentru că pe lume partidul s-a dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a
пустяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 24th of August, 2026, and here we are with a live stream, principally looking at the Great American Debt Scandal. So be sure to stick around for that one. It's going to be very interesting, and I'm going to be drawing from an article I've written recently on the Red Star Daily Substack site, which is my own Substack site. I will post the link into the description so you can see it, into the chat so you can see it all. There you go. Check it out if you have not seen it already. We are currently live on YouTube, on Twitch, on X, on Rumble, and on Substack. So you can find us on all of those platforms. Be sure to subscribe to all the relevant platforms just in case one of them gets destroyed. They tried to block Cena or destroy Cena's channel, the guy who hosts the East is a Podcast, who was very kind to host and promote us recently with the Decline and Fall show. They tried to destroy his channel the other day, but thankfully he got his channel back. And so you never know when this one's going to be hit on the head. Maybe it will be tomorrow after this live stream. Maybe Donald Trump will tune in and see the impression of him and not be pleased. So going to be looking at American debt, which now stands at $40 trillion in just a few moments. But I wanted to start out by acknowledging a certain British Prime Minister who has done his pilgrimage to Kiev. That is, of course, Saint Andrew Burnham. And I say saint advisedly because he is, of course, of the Catholic persuasion. And he has gone like a pilgrim to a holy site to deliver his genuflection before the altar, not of Ukrainian independence, of course, but of NATO and in British imperialism. And in doing so, he has visited his clients in Kiev, including, of course, Mr. Zelensky and the more, shall we say, conservative ambassador of the Kiev regime to London, who prefers just prostitutes rather than cocaine, so I'm told. And that, of course, is the reason, the principal reason here for the visit of Burnham to Kiev is to recommit himself as a new British Prime Minister to standing with Ukraine in its moment of need, etc., etc., etc. Now, Burnham, of course, went there and did it with his own unique style. He sat down and had a jam with a Ukrainian soldier. They played a Smiths song together. I believe it was Vladimir. It was really nothing. And the whole thing just reminded me how much I despise Burnham, possibly more than I do Keir Starmer, or I did Keir Starmer. Because Keir Starmer had the manner of a sort of strangulated man who is enduring a bout of acute metallic constipation. And he would never be described or even could pull off trying to be relatable. When he did try it, it just came across as weird and creepy. Like, hello, I like football, I do. It never really worked. Burnham has been brought in because he appears to be more personable, and that makes him a more effective evil, because he does his whole personable, regular chap act, which of course he's not. And he goes over to Kiev and he says, we stand with Ukraine. And he made a ridiculous statement that I will call up now, where he talks about a statement made by Dmitry Peskov, the vaguely rodent-type creature that speaks for Putin. And Peskov said that British providing of Storm Shadow designs to Ukraine so Ukraine can theoretically manufacture their own missiles. By the way, the prospect of Ukraine manufacturing any Patriots or Storm Shadows or anything else is practically zero. If they try and manufacture them, the Russians will find out where they're doing it and they'll blow it up. So it's a meaningless gesture. Peskov said it will potentially spark some flames or something with regard to British Russian relations, such as do exist, which they barely exist at the moment. Burnham says, well, who started the fire? Which, again, betrays the fact that he is a liar. Because he says, Putin invaded Ukraine and you can't change international borders by force, which is a fucking joke when you consider that Andy Burnham voted for the Iraq War. So is that not a violation of a country's borders, Andy, or Andrew, as I should call you, because Andy is an affectation designed to make him look more human than he is. So what was the Iraq War, which you enthusiastically supported 20 years ago, Andrew, but a violation of a country's borders? Was that not changing the nature of a country by an invasion? Does that not count? Do we not talk about that anymore? What about the ongoing occupation of Afghanistan, which you supported as a minister for nearly a decade? What about that? Did that not count as a violation of sovereignty? What about the war on Syria, which you were conveniently silent on, but which you seemed to support when you were in the shadow cabinet under Ed Miliband? Was that not a violation of a country's borders, or the war on Libya? See, if you start counting up all the various different ways in which this is a complete hypocrisy, then you would be here all day. Now, one of the ways that Burnham will try and weasel around this, and people like him will try and weasel around it, is by saying that, oh, well, we didn't change the borders. No, you just destroyed the country. You left the borders intact. But of course, in Iraq, they didn't. They tried to, and are still trying to make northern Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan, into a separate country anyway. So they did change the borders, but they just pretended that they didn't. There's this typical British ruling class deception and lying and eliding of the truth that is truly nauseating. And he goes there and he says that they support Ukrainian independence because it's Ukrainian Independence Day. Ukraine has never been an independent country. It was nominally independent after 1991, but in truth, it was less independent than it was when it was part of the Soviet Union. Under the Soviet Union, of course, Ukraine had its own seat in the UN. It was nominally, like most of the republics, had the right to leave at any time. These were countries that were in a union with each other. And of course, when that was destroyed by a counter-revolution, Ukraine nominally becomes independent. But in reality, it was never an independent country. There's a series of governments in place which essentially ran headlong under the command of oligarchs to asset strip the country and sell it to, well, whoever was the highest bidder, the West or the oligarchy in Russia. Turned out the West was the highest bidder. Surprise. And they sold that country. And here I'm going to call up, there's a very, I think, perceptive tweet by Ivan Kachanovsky, the man who wrote the book on the Maidan massacre, who is always worth quoting because Kachanovsky was and is a liberal. He's no Marxist. He was an anti-communist back in the late 80s when he was a young man. And I heard a very interesting interview with him where he described that he was an anti-communist, but a certain Petro Poroshenko was a member of the Ukrainian Communist Party and the CPSU, as were a lot of other people who became Maidan supporters, almost as if they just went wherever the power was. Now, Kachanovsky said in a tweet today, self-proclaimed supporters of Ukraine in fact support unwinnable proxy war to the last Ukrainian, an undemocratic, illiberal Zelensky regime, civil war in Donbass, illegal overthrow of Ukrainian government by means of a Maidan massacre, client state status of Ukraine. They brand all this pro-Ukrainian in an Orwellian fashion, and he's 100% correct on all of those points. To call what is being done to Ukraine now support for Ukrainian sovereignty, support for Ukrainian independence, is an obscene farce. It is an absolute. It would be a joke were it not so serious. Were it not the case that many hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million, of Ukrainians have been killed. Ukrainian men mostly, but now you see a story in the Daily Telegraph today about how great it is that Ukraine is empowering women by allowing them to fight in the front lines. Well, that would be empowering, of course, if it was an actual battle for Ukrainian independence, but it's not. They are an outsourced army of these decaying, corpulent, putrefying imperialist powers who are using Ukraine to obtain objectives that they cannot achieve themselves. They cannot, to this day, and they will not, be deploying themselves directly against the Russians. There's a lot of talk at the moment, and I swear we will get to the American debt story, but I wanted to cover this first. There's a lot of talk at the moment for amongst multipolar circles that there's going to be a direct German, French, British intervention. There will not be. There will not be, because they cannot do it. They cannot mobilize their populations. They cannot hope to even replace lost military equipment if they deployed against the Russians in the next 3 to 5 years. They can't do it. And there's no such thing as a limited war with the Russians if they go all in. It won't be done. Not by the British, certainly. Not by the French either, and not by the Germans. The German government under Merz is already on the verge of collapse. It will likely implode if they try to do this. So the thing that is possible is that they try and do to Poland what they've done with Ukraine. Then that's if Ukraine implodes. So it's possible that they will try and mobilize the Poles. But I predict that there will be much more resistance in Poland to them doing that. I don't think that there is anything like the enthusiasm amongst the Polish population that some of the Polish politicians pretend that there is. It's why they had to send volunteers in the form of 10,000 men at least into Ukraine to do the fighting. Mainly these guys seemed to be specialists, officers, and blocking units who would shoot Ukrainians who tried to retreat, apparently. So the prospect of them actually deploying their own men is, I would say, still very, very low. Even if they try and provoke all kinds of shenanigans with the Russians, it's still there's a very, very low chance of them actually deploying their own men. This is why they're keeping Ukraine fighting to the last man. This is why they're keeping Ukrainian women fighting. I mean, one of Paul Mason's ridiculous ideas in his emails that got leaked was that they were going to have all female drone units or something. Well, that Ukraine's now doing that. And now they're talking about deporting fighting age men from European countries to go and die hideously in the east of Ukraine / west of Russia. This is what Ukrainian independence has brought. Now, as Marius points out in the comments, the Ukrainian Communist Party was the biggest single vote winner in several elections in the 1990s. They should have been able to form a government, but they were kept out of power by all kinds of illegal and unconstitutional shenanigans. Same way, really, that the KPRF were deprived of a win in the 1996 presidential election by blatant vote rigging, blatant ballot interference by the imperialist powers and also the Russia of the disgusting kleptocracy that supported Yeltsin. So amongst many former people's democracies and Soviet states, there were various attempts to bring in by the working class to vote in communist parties or their successors in the 90s, all of which were rigged, either rigged to the point where they couldn't take office, or the party that ended up taking office was horribly compromised and couldn't follow through on any of the promises they made. So the Ukrainian people tried to vote in communists in the 90s. Leonid Kuchma, a disgusting, repulsive oligarch type figure who was president in the 90s, cheated them out of it. The Ukrainian Communist Party at the time was run by Petro Simonenko, who's still the leader of it, I believe. So, there was no democracy there, ever. And the horrible irony is that when there were pro-democracy demonstrations in 2004, the so-called Orange Revolution, they were for a guy in the form of Yushchenko, who had actually lost the popular vote. And due to, again, the first attempt at a Maidan coup, they had an unprecedented third round in the presidential election. Yushchenko won that one after massive interference from the West. I mean, they always go on about Russian interference, but if the Russians were doing any kind of interfering in Ukraine in the 90s and the 2000s, it was astonishingly ineffectual and went nowhere because they lost every single time there was an encounter with the West. And the Ukrainians, when they got the chance to vote Yushchenko out, did so 4 years later. So, but that, again, that couldn't be permitted. So 6 years after that, there's a coup. There's a coup in 2014, when, of course, infamously, the Maidan massacre is triggered by, apparently Georgian mercenaries fighting for NATO, shooting into the crowd, killing Maidan supporters and policemen. And this is blamed on Yanukovych, and the whole history unfolds from there. So for this fucking piece of garbage called Burnham to go there and blather on about Ukrainian independence, he is a grotesque liar and jamming away with some Ukrainian soldiers to playing a Smiths song. It's disgusting. I said when Burnham took over that he is the living embodiment of everything that is rotten and repulsive about my home city. And it is even more repulsive on the national stage, justifying militarism with while singing a Smiths song. It's truly, he is the embodiment of like the disgusting reactionary, like faux progressive British ruling class. He's the perfect representative of like dead end British social democracy. He is a disgusting, like debased criminal, and he deserves to be thrown into a correctional facility, or should we say a re-education camp for the rest of his miserable life, to crack rocks alongside Keir Starmer, because what he is doing is supporting the death of Ukraine. Now, to answer Speedy's comment, no, I'm not joking. This really happened. Go and look on Twitter. It's there. It's there on Twitter. I will try and find it for you. Yeah, I'll link to my tweet. There you go. So what Burnham and all the others are supporting is the death of Ukraine. That's what they're doing. Don't let anybody who with a fucking Ukraine flag in the bio lie to you about what this is all about. Because this is about using Ukraine to try and destabilize the Russian Federation, to either put in a Yeltsin type figure or just break it up entirely. It's about the ruin and immiseration of two nations, Ukraine and Russia, by the West. Now, if you've watched this channel for long enough, you'll know my view on those who run Russia, the Putin system. But the bald fact of it is, this is a war created and provoked by the NATO bloc, who are using Ukraine to try and secure their objectives. And it doesn't matter to them if millions die. They'll keep waving the fucking Ukrainian flag, and Burnham will keep saying, "Oh, it's great what you're doing." It's just like Britain in World War II, which is ironic when you consider that Britain pretends to pretended at the time to stand against fascism, but recruited fascists repeatedly before the war and again after it. But there you go. This is a sick joke, and Burnham is the latest comedian to tell this particular joke. Right. President Jesus says, "I'm surprised they didn't bring Johnny Marr in to play the song." Well, I'm surprised they didn't bring Morrissey in, but he's probably given how absolutely should we say eccentric Morrissey is. He's probably anti-Ukraine war, but also pro Nigel Farage in this sort of weird way that he is. But I could absolutely see Johnny Marr doing it. Just like I can absolutely see the Smiths actually getting back together to play a benefit gig for Israel. All right, okay. So moving then to the next part of the show, and before we do that, let's greet everybody who's in the chat. So Speedy from Sheffield, Kelito Brigante from Stirling. Kelito is I take it that's a reference to Carlito's Way, a very fine film from the early 90s and one of Brian De Palma's very best. One of Al Pacino's better later period performances, it has to be said, before he just became Al Pacino with the mad eyes. That you can thank the sort of post Scent of a Woman period for that particular career highlight, Though Michael Mann should also bear his share of responsibility for giving Al Pacino the line in Heat, "I bet she got a great ass," and you got your head all the way up it, Apparently the Al Pacino character in Heat was supposed to be a cokehead, but they took it out. His performance makes a deal more sense if you consider that the character was written as a coke fiend. There you go. So, hello to Victor, Walter Stolzig, Working Prole, Akhmadovich Naz, Metal Nick from Montana, USA, Robson from Newcastle upon Tyne. Is there fog on the Tyne tonight, one might ask. Philip Blair, Zhukov's Boots, Nikolai Mayer from Bern, Perfidious Joe. We've got Wilbur Waitley. We have Jerry from Southern England. We have Marius. We have Cherry Cupcake. We have Alex from Brazil. We have Davy from the wild northwest of Wales. We have Alex Moore from Fife. We have President Jesus from the land of Gavin Newsom. We have Dallas Ken. Supposedly, I'm assuming from Dallas. We have Caustic Grip, David King. We have Anthony McKeown from Prague. We also have Electric Sand and Irish Partisan and Nikolai VE93 from Sweden. Al Pacino was a great Shylock. Yes, he was very good. Right. So, also Brad Wall, hello to you. So, let's get into it then. The Great American Debt Scandal is the latest article I've got up on my Substack. I'm going to read through it with some digressions. It's about the fact that the US has now reached the 40 trillion mark in terms of national debt. So, I'll get into this. I'm going to read through it and pause every now and again for elaboration. So, here we go. One of the advantages of hitting your 40s, which of course I have, is that you can remember back through different generations of political controversies. Anyone who remembers the farce and the fraud of the Obama years will recall the endless histrionics from the Republican Party and the endless sellouts by the Democrats over the much fabled debt ceiling. Earlier still is the propaganda from the 90s and the 1980s about how government borrowing was an evil which needed to be clamped down upon. In the fullness of time, all of these arguments from the bourgeoisie and their tame politicians turned to ashes. The borrowing of the US government continually exploded over the last 3 decades, whilst the fevered rhetoric about the evils of debt remained. Now, this, of course, is the neoliberal period summed up, which is a lot of rhetoric about the government living within its means, about not spending more than you take in, about Margaret Thatcher saying, I work out the budget like a good housewife, which of course she's never really been. You shouldn't spend more than you take in, which of course is just a monstrous joke when you consider how much consumer debt that families in the US and Britain and most of the imperialist countries are in now. And also the fact that they always used debt to bail out the ruling class themselves, as we will see. We continue. So it is no surprise, really, that last week the United States national debt crossed the $40 trillion mark, months ahead of forecasters' expectations, and just 5 months after it passed the first $39 trillion mark. The immediate accelerant tells you everything about the class character of the moment. The Supreme Court struck down the Trump tariff regime, forcing the US Treasury to refund over $100 billion in import duties, money that now has to be borrowed, on top of a deficit already running over $2 trillion a year. $1 trillion of that alone can be devoted to, of course, the defense budget. The number is growing by roughly $1 trillion every 5 months, as it has since 2020. It has doubled since 2017. It amounts to around 123% of GDP, and it now costs the US government roughly $1 trillion a year just in interest payments, more than it spends, of course, on its own military machine. Not if Trump has his way, of course. The business press reports all of this with a furrowed brow and calls it unsustainable. It is worth being more precise about what is actually happening. The American state is being converted before our very eyes, and in many ways has already been converted, into a tribute mechanism for finance capital, and its own creditors are becoming the arbiters of imperial policy. None of this would have surprised Marx, Engels, or Lenin. They described the machinery while it was being built. And the next subheading is the credo of capital. Marx treated the national debt not as an aberration, but as one of the founding institutions of capitalism itself. In the chapter of Capital on the Genesis of the Industrial Capitalist, Marx wrote the following, quote, national debts, i.e. the alienation of the state, whether despotic, constitutional, republican, marked with its stamp the capitalistic era. The only part of the so-called national wealth that actually enters the collective possessions of modern peoples is their national debt. Public credit becomes the credo of capital, and with the rise of national debt making, want of faith in the national debt takes the place of blasphemy against the Holy Ghost, which may not be forgiven. Unquote. Note the mechanism Marx isolates here. It reads like a description of the modern treasury market. Quote, the public debt becomes one of the most powerful levers of primitive accumulation. As with the stroke of an enchanter's wand, it endows barren money with the power of breeding and thus turns it into capital, without the necessity of its exposing itself to the troubles and risks inseparable from its employment in industry or even in usury. The state creditors actually give nothing away, for the sum lent is transformed into public bonds, easily negotiable, which go on functioning in their hands just as so much hard cash would. Unquote. The state creditor gives nothing away. He hands over cash and receives back a liquid tradable asset that pays him for interest forever, funded by taxation of the working class. And who pays? Marx was blunt about this fact. The fiscal system built around the debt contains within itself the germ of automatic progression. Overtaxation is not an incident, but rather a principle, unquote. And this is how the ledger reached 40 trillion. In the year 2000, the gross federal debt stood at $5.7 trillion. The government was running a surplus, and official projections discussed paying off the debt entirely within a decade. A quarter of a century of ruling class policy has produced, though, the present number. So, how did we get here? First of all, tax cuts for capital. In the US, there have been 7 rounds of tax cuts, principally for the wealthiest people, since 2001. There's the Bush tax cuts, followed by the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and the recent One Big Beautiful Bill. This stripped out, in total, roughly $8.7 trillion in revenue, about 30% of the total increase in debt. Imperialist wars and corporate welfare added to it. The wars on Afghanistan and Iraq associated spending with those added $7.6 trillion to the debt. And of course, there is socializing the crises of capital. The 2008 bailouts and the COVID interventions added a total of $6.8 trillion to the debt. The state's balance sheet deployed without limit to rescue the system while the bill was left to accumulate. The compounding interest, the residue that is now becoming the main story. The asymmetry is the point. Revenue was cut at the top of the society. The costs of empire and capital's own crises were socialized. The $40 trillion is not a bookkeeping accident. It is the ledger of a ruling class that refuses to pay for its own system, and of a state that, as Engels put it, quote, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine. The state of the capitalist, the ideal personification of the total national capital, unquote. And the next subheading is the $1 trillion tribute. Here is where quantitative becomes qualitative. Net interest cost the US government $970 billion in fiscal year 2025. That's 3.2% of GDP, a post-war record share, and is crossing the $1 trillion mark in financial year 2026, making it the second largest line in the entire federal budget after Social Security. The Congressional Budget Office projects it will reach $2.1 trillion a year by 2036, some $16.2 trillion over the decade. The interest already exceeds the defense budget. It already exceeds Medicaid. It already consumes the entire corporate income tax. This is a direct transfer of surplus value extracted through taxation to the owners of financial capital, the banks, funds, insurers, foreign central banks, and wealthy households who hold roughly $32 trillion of publicly held debt. Marx, anatomizing interest-bearing capital in volume 3 of Das Kapital, caught the essence of a state and a class living this way. Quote, in its capacity of interest-bearing capital, capital claims the ownership of all wealth which can ever be produced, and everything it has received so far is but an installment for its all-engrossing appetite. By its innate laws, all surplus labor which the human race can ever perform belongs to it. Moloch, unquote. He left us a rather delicious historical footnote. The 18th century British state rationalized its debt through the Reverend Dr. Price's fantasy of compound interest, a sinking fund that would magically spiral into infinity. Marx's comment was as follows, quote, "What a pretty theoretical introduction to the national debt of England," unquote. And he summarized William Pitt's fiscal method as, quote, "an infinity of loans to pay loans," unquote. The US Treasury in 2026 borrowing over $2 trillion a year in new money while rolling over trillions more of maturing paper is Dr. Price's system with the mask off. In 2025 alone, it ran more than 400 auctions and sold roughly 29.7 trillion in marketable securities, most of it simply refinancing the old debt at new, higher rates of interest. The average interest rate carried by the debt is more than doubled since the cheap money era as pandemic era paper matures and reprices. And then our next subheading is the bond market as the commanding heights of state power. This is the vulnerability, and it deserves to be stated in class terms. The US state's solvency is not tested annually at budget time. It is tested every week at auction. When the market's appetite wavers, the consequences are immediate. In March of 2026, consecutive Treasury auctions went so badly that primary dealers, that's the banks contractually obliged to absorb what genuine buyers refused to buy, had to take up double their normal share at yield concessions called tails across the curve. The 10-year yield has climbed to about 4.7% and the 30-year yield above 5.2%, despite Federal Reserve rate cuts. The market, not the central bank, now sets the state's marginal borrowing cost. Meanwhile, the foreign bid, the foundation of the exorbitant privilege once denounced by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the former president of France, is quietly withdrawing. Foreigners hold about $9.3 trillion of treasury bonds, roughly 30% of the publicly held stock, but the composition is shifting. Japan, the largest holder, is starting to have to sell them to defend the yen. That was what was behind the US intervention to support the yen recently. And Chinese holdings have fallen to their lowest level since 2008. The weaponization of the dollar, the freezing of Russian and Iranian reserves, taught every central bank on earth that treasury holdings are safe assets only for as long as Washington approves of your policies. Reserve diversification is now rational self-defense. Marx described exactly this power relation in 1850 when he was dissecting the July monarchy of the House of Savoy, a regime which he wrote, the ruling financial aristocracy, quote, had a direct interest in the indebtedness of the state. The state deficit was really the main object of its speculation and the chief source of its enrichment. At the end of the year, at the end of each year, a new deficit. After the lapse of 4 or 5 years, a new loan. And every new loan offered up new opportunities to the finance aristocracy for defrauding the state, which was kept artificially on the verge of bankruptcy. It had to negotiate with the bankers under the most unfavorable conditions, unquote. The July monarchy, he concluded, quote, was nothing other than a joint stock company for the exploitation of France's national wealth. And he distilled the whole relationship into one sentence that could serve as the epigraph for the present era. Quote, public credit rests on confidence that the state will allow itself to be exploited by the wolves of finance, unquote. Every treasury auction in the US is a test of that confidence. Every failed auction is the wolves baring their teeth. Engels, for his part, identified the mechanism of rule in a democratic republic. Wealth, quote, exercises its power indirectly, but all the more surely, unquote, through the corruption of the officials and through the alliance of the government and the stock exchange. The revolving door between the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and Wall Street, the primary dealer system, the institutional veto the bond market holds over any policy that might displease it. This is that alliance perfected. It disciplines every government, regardless of the party. No program that frightens the long bond survives contact with the auction calendar. Next subtitle is The Usurer State in Decline. Lenin gave this formation a name. Writing in 1916 in his classic work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, at the height of the last great wave of financialization, he observed the following, quote, "Imperialism is an immense accumulation of money capital in a few countries, hence the extraordinary growth of a class, or rather of a stratum of rentiers, i.e., people who live by clipping coupons, who take no part in any enterprise whatever, whose profession is idleness. The rentier state is a state of parasitic, decaying capitalism." Unquote. The United States was once the world's greatest creditor, the power whose navy, in the words of Lenin, quoting from the German writer Schultz Gavenitz, quote, "plays the part of bailiff in case of necessity," unquote, for the creditor nations. Today, it is history's greatest debtor, and the tribute flows increasingly outward. Hundreds of billions a year in interest to foreign holders, and $1 trillion in total to the coupon clippers at home and abroad. There is a deeper historical rhyme here, and Marx himself sketched it, tracing how, quote, "the villainies of the Venetian thieving system became a secret source of Dutch wealth, and Dutch lending in turn built up England." He added, quote, "the same thing is going on today between England and the United States," unquote. Giovanni Arrighi built his account of hegemonic cycles in the long 20th century on exactly this pattern. In the autumn of every systemic cycle of accumulation, whether it is Genoese, Dutch, or British, the declining hegemon turns from production to finance. Its state becomes a debtor to the moneyed interests its own power nurtured, and the system's center of accumulation migrates. The US state, paying $1 trillion tribute to bondholders every year, while its auctions falter, its allies are strong-armed into holding its paper, and its chief rivals pare back their treasury holdings to pre-2008 levels. This is Arrighi's signal crisis rendered as a treasury yield curve. And the constraint binds the war machine too. An imperial state that must refinance trillions of dollars of marketable debt every year at prices set by a market that includes its rival central banks has its room for maneuver set in New York and Tokyo as much as in Washington. When the Cato Institute, and they are hardly a hotbed of Marxism, warns that America's defense cannot depend on the assumption that investors will always finance unlimited deficits at favorable rates, the ruling class is admitting the contradiction out loud. An empire that must watch the term premium while it plans its wars will increasingly subcontract them. Hence the desperate push to remilitarize both Germany and Japan. Well, of course, as I made clear earlier, I don't think either of those will actually pay off for them. Here we have some conclusions. The $40 trillion milestone is not a story about fiscal imprudence. It is a story about what kind of state the United States has become. It is a machine for transferring value from labor to capital, now so thoroughly financialized that its own creditors hold a standing veto over its policies, so indebted that interest alone outruns the largest war budget in human history. Marx's modern bankocracy, Lenin's state of the usurers, the categories are no longer merely polemical. They are the second largest line item in the federal budget and are growing faster than any other item. The entire political debate in US bourgeois politics over debt thus always was a cruel farce. The reality is that when faced with dangers to profits or threats to the whole system brought about by that system's parasitism, there is no limit to the amount of debt the US ruling class is prepared to generate. They hold much of it themselves. And so the process of bailing out themselves can be turned into securing an endless tribute from the state that bailed them out in the first place. It is a brutal expression of the class war on the American worker and the utter parasitism and decay of US capitalism. The wolves of finance demand their tribute. The question for the working class that pays it is how long the tribute will be paid and what it will take for the working class of the United States to refuse to pay it any longer. So, the point I'm making here, it shouldn't be confused with some sort of endorsement of the Clintonian 90s, because the Clintonian 90s built the foundations of sand that were eventually washed away in the 2000s. Bush tax cuts that I mentioned there, they aren't just an example of like corporate greed or the greed of the individual members of the ruling class, even though, of course, that is a factor. What the Bush tax cuts were designed to do is to respond to, in actual fact, a crisis of the system that already existed. The Bush tax cuts were planned because, well, partly again, it's a reward for those who backed the Bush campaign, but they were a response of a certain section of the U.S. elite to a crisis in the system that had already come about, which is the end of the dot-com bubble. See, the Clintonian 90s inflated that bubble, just as they started inflating the house price bubble. See, all the growth in the 90s was essentially based on two things: continued attacks on the U.S. working class, and the shipping over to other countries of capital and jobs that to go with it, and of course the inflation of a series of asset bubbles, all also fueled by a never-ending series of mergers and acquisitions. All of this just created a series of bubbles which started to go pop in the early 2000s. The Bush administration attempted to reinflate these bubbles by giving the ruling class tax cuts. The ruling class promptly invested in, diverted this into more bubbles, principally the property bubble, because one of the things you see in when you look at like the ruling class investment patterns, either in Britain or in the United States, is that they're not invested in any real productive capacity. What they're investing in is speculative speculation on various assets, pouring money into various bubbles and trying to find a return. They're not doing productive investment. In fact, the U.S. ruling class just isn't investing in anything productive any more than the British are. Their biggest, the big new wheeze is again the AI bubble, which is which is inflated under the same false promises that the dot-com bubble was inflated under, that this will lead to a massive amount of automation that will enable like huge amounts of labor saving and thus reinvigorate American capitalism. It won't happen. They'll be profoundly disappointed, the same way they were with the dot-com bubble. But this is what stands behind the Bush administration tax cuts. The attempt to like reinflate bubbles to keep things on the road for a few more years. You think about that when Bush did the tax cuts in the early 2000s, it was only really 6 years between the tax cuts going in and the massive crisis of 2008. That's not a long time. So basically enough time to inflate a bubble and have it go pop again, which was the essence of the crisis of 2008. So these tax cuts it is an example of parasitism, but it's a policymaker's particular response to a generalized crisis of American capitalism anyway, which is low investment rates. And when the American ruling class is given money supposedly to invest, they just do stock buybacks, payouts, and more speculation, more bubble inflation. So this is an insoluble crisis. There's no way around it. It's not just that as the Cato Institute or other reactionary think tanks would say, that you have the American policymakers have been imprudent with their policy choices. No, it's that the American economy has been hovering on the brink of a massive crisis multiple times. And occasionally this crisis breaks out, and what's the response? Massive bailouts. Because long ago, as early as like the 1960s, it became obvious that in the imperialist countries, the state and the central bank had become the guarantors of last resort of the profitability of the system. So if a company that's big enough gets into trouble, more than likely it's a bank or a hedge fund, the state has to step in to stop it going pop, which is what 2008 was all about, using the power of the state's money-generating capacities, and it's through the central bank sometimes, to generate money to bail out a system which has just gone completely rotten. And all of this adds to the gigantic amount of debt. Now, here I want to just comment on the ideological side of things, because you get this all of the bullshit from the neoliberal politicians about got to spend within means, there is no magic money tree, etc., etc., which is all garbage, of course. When it's in the class interest of the ruling class to create money digitally, they'll do so. But also from the other side, then you get like SocDem saying we need a wealth tax, or some other really like lame, pathetic response which doesn't deal with the problem at all. Because if you do a wealth tax, well, what will happen then is exactly what I've just talked about. The risks are that what they'll do in the United States, if say you get a DSA president, maybe you'll get President AOC. Probably not, but maybe. Or some other Democratic Party clown decides to do a wealth tax. What's going to happen? Well, the first thing that will happen to America as a whole is roughly what happened to New York City in the 1970s. No one will buy your bonds. America would be pitched into a massive debt crisis where the dollar would become instantly devalued, because no one will buy American debt anymore. The big financial institutions that buy it would not underwrite a government that was going against their interests. And then what do you do? Well, in the case of New York City, like remember the old headline, Ford to City, drop dead, when the federal government refused to bail out New York, and the bond issue, the bond buyers refused to buy any more bonds. Well, that was the ruling class making their demands known to the government of New York, that they wanted changes, and changes were delivered by successive New York mayors and governors of New York State. Now, the same thing would happen to the United States as a whole if the fabled wealth tax was attempted to be implemented. The only way they would tolerate it is if perhaps the threat to their system was so great that they would agree to a temporary concession. But I can't see them agreeing to that, because again, the system's just too rotten. So this is the nature of the beast now. Like there is no getting rid of this debt. The American state can never pay it off, and the parasitic ruling class doesn't want them to pay it off. This is guaranteed profitability for those domestic debt bondholders. You're guaranteed a dividend. You're guaranteed to get your coupon clipped if you hold American debt, because no government will ever do anything now to upset the bondholders, because again, the bond buyers don't turn up. The bonds don't get bought. The American government can't sell its treasuries anymore. Instant crisis. The actual maneuverability of the federal government, whether it's run by Trump or whether it's run by Gavin Newsom, Ocasio-Cortez, or the ghost of Richard Nixon, it doesn't matter. The debt is so gigantic that the crisis that would follow, should the bond buyers refuse to buy, would be catastrophic. Which again is how the British government is disciplined. When one of its prime ministers goes rogue, such as Liz Truss did, the bondholders revolt, the buyers of British debt revolt, and the government crumbles. Because to take on the bondholders, you would need to have, it would need to be a revolutionary movement that could do that. Not a presidency headed by some Democrat, or even a presidency headed by some Republican. To actually deal with the crisis that the holders of American debt can unleash on America, you'd need a mass movement of the working class that's capable of withstanding that kind of pressure. DSA is not going to build that. Really, they're not. These are people who wave their arms in the air to indicate agreement because they don't like clapping. Do you really think they're capable of taking on the holders of American debt? I don't think so. So this is the nature of things. This is now an indebted, parasitic system that keeps becoming more and more in debt, and the parasitic ruling class keeps drawing their dividends from the debt. So the principal enemy of the American worker of course, is at home. But and it is no longer just a question of it being a capitalist. Of course, the capitalist class are always an enemy, but now it is a question of the fact that the American workers' enemy is a ruling class that is, to use our word of the day, completely parasitic, does not produce anything, lives off clipping coupons from American debt, and demands constant transfers of wealth based on more debt to pay them their tribute. That's the nature of the enemy of the American worker. A ruling class that has long since stopped productive investment, long since stopped actually producing anything. All it can do now is produce endless bubbles, which only make the crisis worse. Right, let's have a look for comments here. Right. Edward says, I've been reading and listening up on China. It's depressing, and I have come to the conclusion that they have built capitalism under the red flag, and a gang of four trial is a crime against communism. Interesting. Lot to say on China. Can't really get into it now, but just to say, look, they have been on the capitalist road for over 40 years. It's not a controversial thing to say. Now, whether they remain on it is an interesting question. In fact, I should probably do a China stream all free. I promised it a long time ago, so to take up Edward's question, yeah, we definitely need to do a China stream. But no, they're on the capitalist road. The Chinese government retains more control over its economy than like a lot of other governments do. But it's not just a question of the Chinese private sector or the presence of billionaires or the presence of market mechanisms. It's a question of what are the relations of production. That's the question that the Maoists used to ask. And it's a question of like, well, what is the influence of the working class upon the Chinese government? And there's no real argument in my mind over the fact that influence diminished over the Deng Xiaoping, Yang Zemin, Hu Jintao period. Now, has that influence increased again in recent years? There's an argument to say that it has. There's also arguments to say that it hasn't. But undoubtedly, the economic progress of China was built upon the hyper-exploitation of Chinese labor, often by foreign capitalists. And the relations of production inside the state sector, well, what are they like? And in the truth be told, they mirror the labor disciplinary mechanisms deployed by the capitalists. So this is a country that's been on the capitalist road. Now, could it change? It could, but it's foolish to deny it. And the fanboys of China don't do anybody any favors by saying all done by a socialist government. Well, even the Chinese government doesn't claim it's socialist. They say they are a people's democracy still. They don't claim to have reached socialism yet. So the fanboys in the West don't do anybody any favors, I don't think. But more on that in future episodes. Let's have a look. Has anyone seen this channel, Gary's Economics? Ryan Graham gave it a huge shout out today in Broken Points. Yeah, it's slop. I believe Gary Economics, the guy who runs it, was a city trader of some kind. He then quit, declared he wanted to expose the reality of life in Britain, and then he quit that because he said the spotlight was too much. So I don't bother with him, to be honest. That Ryan Grimm would be a fan doesn't surprise me. RCM says, Steve Keen writes that private debt in the USA, particularly on speculative gambling on LLM AI bubble, is much worse, as it is built on bank-created money and will contract when the bubble pops. Yeah. It's not going to be pretty when that goes down. Why is live stream coming up on Shorts? Let's have a quick look. It's because it's going out in 2 different formats on YouTube. Restream started doing this thing where it goes out in like mobile fashion as well, so people can watch it more effectively on the mobile phones. It depends which one you've clicked on, basically. Edward says, a Latvian SOCDEM professor claims that if only Latvia did what Germany does and have a national development bank, we could print money forever by owning our own debt and building welfare like the Germans. Well, the Germans have been slashing their welfare capitalist regime to pieces for 20 years. It started under Schroeder. And this idea, like we can print money forever. The MM. In fact, I need to probably do like a critique of modern monetary theory, because it really is a complete nonsense. And the idea that Latvia could like print its own money forever, the only states that can do that are states who are always going to find buyers for their debt, basically, which are the imperialist states. They're the only states who can do it, and even then, it's only under certain circumstances. Well, you think there's the argument that the MMTers make that you print the money and then you deploy it in building up productive capacity, basically. But again, I don't think the MMTers really understand what money is. I think it's as much voodoo as like supply side stuff. How about Truman, Eisenhower, JFK era tax levels? Again, wouldn't be accepted by the ruling class. They would revolt instantly. Hello from ACP Virginia, comrades. Hello to you. Motor Jason says, American left is such a joke. Did you see that Trotskyite letter of solidarity published in The Guardian? Yeah, we're going to talk about that on the Decline and Fall show. But all I'll say now is, well, why are you really surprised? Like, what, Angela Davis is pro-imperialist? She's been that way for years. For many, many years. She's like a pro-Clintonite person. Like, she goes around. I mean, Norman Finkelstein did the definitive rant about her prison abolitionist bullshit, because it is bullshit. Like, you take a demand that is related to end-stage communism, which is abolish prisons, and you try and apply it in the status of like decaying American capitalism, which is never going to do it. It's just an academic fucking grift. So you can go around and you can give talks to like wealthy, guilty people and say, oh, we should abolish prisons. Oh, that's a great idea, Angela. Have some more money. It's a grift. It's a con. It's like defund the police is a con. It's like, you asking the capitalist state to defund its own special bodies of armed men? They're never going to do that. Just like the defense budget's never going to be cut. It's only going to get bigger. It's a farce and a joke. And anybody who tries to sell that to you is a con artist. So just to go back to like the Angela Davises of the world, Angela Davis was a part of a pro, I think, Gorbachevite split in the old CPUSA that tried to destroy it once and for all. She's been like a pro-Democrat for years, and was like recommending a vote for fucking Hillary Clinton, the woman who is like an enthusiastic supporter of her husband's crime bill, which locked up more people than any other piece of legislation in recent American history. But she's for prison abolition. No, she's fucking not. It's ridiculous. Like, the American left is ridiculous. I mean, British left's no better. Don't get me wrong. But the American left is particularly ridiculous because they do this thing where they come up with like ultra-left sloganeering. But again, I'm an example of how ultra-left and ultra-opportunism are just part of the same circle. One reinforces the other. And sometimes they're like ultra-left screaming, abolish the police, abolish prisons, vote for Beto O'Rourke, vote for Gavin Newsom, vote for Hillary Clinton, or something like that. That's the American left in essence. And but they're all imperialists, other than a few. There's small groups of actual anti-imperialists in the United States, and respect and solidarity to all of them. But the actual American left, like the fucking DSA, the ISO, which is now done entryism into the DSA, the various American like fucking pseudo Maoist groups, which consist of about 5 gender confused like students living in their parents' basements, the various like ridiculous American Trotskyite organizations that still exist. Most of them are just objectively speaking pro-imperialist. They're a ridiculous bunch. So why is anybody surprised that a bunch of fucking scumbag academics who should never be listened to on anything ever would write this letter? Because essentially what they were demanding is that like Iran let out those poor political prisoners, well, many of whom are agents of the US or agents of the British or agents of the Israelis or all of the above, who have been engaging in acts of terrorism directed against the Iranian population on behalf of the imperialist powers. It's the same bullshit that they used to get from like leftists screaming about human rights in the Soviet Union. It's like, well, you don't mean it for a second. You know, this is not serious. Like whatever flaws the Soviet Union has, Western SOCDEMs are the very least qualified to talk about it. Because look at all the shit that they've supported over the years. The thing that defines the 20th century politically, more than anything else, is the continual treachery to the point of sheer murderousness of social democracy. In my view, controversial view possibly, what defines the 20th century is the failure of reformism and its selling out of the working class in the form of the Second International and in the form of what happened to the communist parties. It's the consistent sellout of reformism and their consistent support of imperialism, sometimes publicly and proudly, sometimes tacitly, that defines why there was no revolution in the West in the 20th century. President Jesus says, sorry, just to conclude the point. So, and again, like the politics that like Angela Davis and the other clowns support, which is watery social democracy filtered through the Democratic Party, can't exist without imperial plunder. So in that sense, it makes complete sense for them to back imperialist assault on Iran or Russia or China or anywhere else, because their politics can't be funded without the asset stripping of other nations. Same way Zoran Mamdani's politics can't be funded without the asset stripping of other nations. So yes, we want to see the life of the working class improved in our own countries, but because we're communists, we do not accept, not for one moment, that has to happen on the backs of oppressed and exploited people in other parts of the world. We do not accept that. Those that do are scum and should be labeled as such. Right. President Jesus says Senator John Ossoff is almost certainly the Democratic Party's next nominee. Every progressive shithead will promote him because he has a few criticisms of Israel. Well, that's the way to go. You know, criticisms of Netanyahu. So they're always critical of Netanyahu. It's all his fault. You know. Hello to Ogas Cybernetics from Idaho. Edward says about China exactly it is about the relations of production and simply fanboying over crude material production, productive forces, whatever that sometimes means is an anti-Marxist line of analysis. That is correct. I'll never understand how a Marxist-Leninist government had a fucking housing bubble, because it's not a Marxist-Leninist government. Again, it is at best a people's democracy with reference to China. And yes, they allowed the housing bubble to go down in a way that wouldn't have been done in the West, because again, they retained more control over their system and they have an ability to make certain members of the Chinese capitalist class take a hit every now and again. But that's not the same as a government that's on the path to socialism, and I don't think that it is. How about Vietnam? Well, Vietnam's the same model as China, basically. Will we ever, me and Kit, ever do a cooking stream? Well, I would do it if there was enough enthusiasm. I mean, I can cook a few things. Edward says, I think the MMT And Latvian Sockdem guy is a clown, by the way. Is anti-Marxist as excludes imperialism and the role states play and finance plays in imperialism. Yeah. All right. Dick Cheney hated Gerhard Schroeder and Jacques Chirac, called them old Europe. Yeah, well, Gerhard Schroeder was a scumbag. Absolute scumbag. A real enemy of the German working class. Well, what else we got here? Ice has Darth Vader style gloves now. Yes, I saw that. The deployment of them by the Trump administration seems to have calmed down slightly, but still go. I mean, they've avoided generating any more headlines, but they'll still be out there brutalizing and torturing people, of course. Philip Blair says CIA and MI6 trained militants were exactly the individuals who went around Afghanistan destroying ancient works of art. True, including those giant Buddhas that have been cherished by local Muslims for centuries. They're also true. Okay. Yes, well, I mean, that's the same thing with like ISIS and all that in Syria and elsewhere. Like these people were trained in a laboratory by the West to be essentially like a fascist movement. And then they say, oh, wow, look at these terrible Muslims doing these awful things. Yeah, they're your allies. They're your foot soldiers. You deployed them in Afghanistan, in Syria in the 80s, in Bosnia in the 90s, again in Libya and Syria and elsewhere. They are the fascist boot boys who are deployed by the empire as mercenaries. Okay, so there's enthusiasm for a Scottish cooking live stream. Okay. Well, we'll have a look at that. Edward asks, will there ever be a decline and fall special live from Pyongyang? We can learn from the DPRK how to combat revisionism. If Sockdemism is the evil number one in the 20th century, then revisionism is number two. Well, revisionism is is Sockdemism. I mean, the revisionists became social democrats. In essence, they took over the role of the Second International parties or shared it with them. Garland the Wise says, without a defund movement, there is no pushback of the ever-increasing violence of various police forces across the states. Well, I disagree with you there, because why not talk about it honestly? Why not just make it about police violence? Because really, I mean, why hide it behind a demand which can never be satisfied? Why not just talk directly about police violence? So what, you're going to elect some Democrats who are going to try and divert police resources into, as Mamdani's doing, mental health services? Well, that's going to stop the violence of the US, various different US police forces, is it? No, the violence and militarization of the US police forces is a direct symptom of the fact that the system is in an extreme crisis, and the fact that they've been militarizing for over 30 years should tell you that. So why not talk about police militarization and the reasons for it, and try and educate the working class on those reasons? I mean, the working class in many areas of the United States will be very well aware of police militarization. They'll been on the receiving end of it. Why not talk about why the police are so violent? Why not talk about that? Why not talk about why why they created DHS, why they created these new armed groups that the state has at its disposal to deploy to terrorize the population? Why hide it behind a utopian slogan which most workers are going to look at and disregard? How is defund the police isn't going to bring anybody in towards you? I don't think. Stop police violence. People will more understand that. Because if you're working class in the United States, especially the poorer end working class, you'll have been subject to a lot of police violence. So why not talk about that? Why not talk about the need to get rid of police agencies? Why not raise the demand to do away with the Department of Homeland Security? Do away with DHS, which of course would do away with ICE. Demilitarize, make the demand to demilitarize policing, because that would have more resonance rather than some silly utopian slogan like defund the police or abolish prisons. No, abolish DHS, not abolish ICE. That's just one element of DHS. Abolish DHS, an agency built on a gigantic fraud. See our coming 9/11 special on the Decline and Fall show for more details on that. Built on the gigantic fraud that what was needed to prevent a 9/11 was another gigantic bureaucracy, another gigantic security bureaucracy. Well, the various different security bureaucracies that did exist before 9/11 knew exactly when 9/11 was going to happen and who was going to do it, and strangely couldn't stop it. But yeah, what was needed was another bigger, gigantic, bloated bureaucracy and several different armed forces underneath it, because that'll work. So advance those ideas, I would say, against police violence, against the Department for Homeland Security, which is nothing of the kind, and against like the overarching power of the federal government, against the arbitrary powers of detention given to federal and local law enforcement agencies, against militarization, against everything that's happened to policing in America over the last 30 years. Demand democratic accountability. That's the thing. I mean, of course, you're never going to get like true accountability for the police and the federal law enforcement agencies and the secret services under capitalism, but demand it anyway. There's a lot of powers in the American Constitution and the constitutions of certain states, which might enable you, if you manage to get the correct legislators elected and had enough of a powerful street movement, to force accountability on the police. Now, of course, as Philip Blair points out in the comments, county sheriffs are supposed to be accountable, supposed to be. In reality, they're not. But you can push these ideas. So stop advancing these daft slogans and start talking about what's real, which is militarization, violence, the overarching power of these federal agencies. Start talking about getting rid of them, that they're not needed, that they are just tools of the ruling class to hit the working class over the head with. Do that. That's the thing. That's the thing to advance. Stop with the useless slogans that sound good, but in reality just are meaningless. And if you say, well, defund the police is actually about reducing police violence, then talk about police violence. Well, again, why the addiction to silly slogans? Can anybody explain that, other than the fact that, as President Jesus says in the comments, Americans love a cheap slogan? Ogas Cybernetics says Vietnam is a similar economy party dynamic, but they're in the potential opposition to China phase. US eyes Vietnam against China like they did with China and the Soviet Union. Yeah, I doubt that will work. I mean, I don't think the Vietnamese are stupid enough to be pushed into that, but you can see why the US is considering it. Right, okay. So I'm going to bring things to a close here for this evening. Thanks to the 400 plus of you watching right now. This video will be divided into its component parts and posted on the YouTube page tomorrow with slightly upgraded sound. So we also have coming up tomorrow, we have the latest installment in the Marxist State Theory course on Patreon, followed by on Wednesday the economic component of that, the economics course, and we'll find time for a Q&A on Patreon this week as well. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Thanks to everybody who supports this program on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. This work would not be possible without all of your support. Thanks for tuning in. Be back with you again tomorrow. And I'll say good night to you all.